I'm Greg Garbos of Four Season Tools. What we're going to talk about is how to build a fixed end wall with two 4x8 sliding doors for a 30-foot wide tunnel. This tunnel has an 8-foot trellis height, meaning the sidewall height's about 6 feet 7 inches. The trellis height up to the collar tie will be at 8 feet. What we have here is we're going to use the same template we used when we built all of our trusses with our different stakes in the ground to put our hoop tops together. I've also grabbed a diagram from our installation manual about how all the different parts go together to make sure that I understand which piece goes where. So, we have our template from before with two different stakes in the ground. The stakes are in the ground where the inside to inside dimension of the stakes is 1 inch shy of the width of the tunnel. Since we have a 30-foot wide tunnel, these stakes go in at 29 feet 11 inches. We put another stake here to make sure that we maintain that width. When we build the hoop, we want to make sure the bottom of the hoop is at the bottom of the stakes. Once we have the hoop pieces, the two roof hoop pieces and the top, the ridge hoop piece, we make sure that before we put the pieces together, we slide the brace bands on ahead of time. For this design, there'll be 4 different brace bands on each side. After they're on, we'll be able to slide them into place. Once we have the hoop where we want it, we install 2 self-tapping screws. So what we're going to need for this job is we're going to need some impact wrenches with 5/16 magnetic bits for the number 12 self-tapping screws, and also a 1/2 inch socket, deep socket for our brace band bolts. Now that we've got it all together, everything's screwed into place, right? We now have basically what's going to be the top of the hoop. Nothing is laid out yet, but before we do anything, we got to get the hoop tops together. We're going to talk briefly about what some of the different parts are. So this is basically where we're going to start, but behind me over here to the right, we have all the different components that we're going to use. So we have our different hoop pieces. This is a prefabricated peak vent. This peak vent has already been sheeted with polycarbonate, and it has retractable bottoms. The retractable bottoms are installed inside of there. Sometimes these can also ship separately. For this one, this came pre-assembled. We have all of our different components over here. We've got some 2-inch pieces with no holes in them at all. And then back here we have a lot of the different studs for the end wall. The studs themselves are 2 inches, and there's a lot of 1 3/4 inch pegs. The 1 3/4 inch pegs are designed so you can take your 2-inch end wall pieces and they sleeve over the 1 3/4 inch pegs, making a really, really strong joint there. So we've got several different sizes of the 2-inch studs. We've got several different pieces of the studs with the welded pegs on them. And then we also have several of these telescoping ends. What these are for is where the different end wall studs hit the hoops, right, allows there to be some adjustment. So this is a 1 3/4 inch pipe that sleeves in and out of a 2-inch stud. This will then attach to our brace bands at the different points where the square hits the round, making a nice strong connection. So what we've done is we showed in the last step how to install the hoop tops inside the jig to make sure that it's the proper width. We screwed the hoop pieces together. The next thing we did is we looked at our diagrams for how all the different components went together, and we laid them all out. Here we laid it out in an exploded view. So we have is the peak vent is all the way up in the top. The peak vent on the bottom of the peak vent, there are retractable legs. That allows us to fit the peak vent exactly into the end wall. On the top of the peak vent, we want to put it as high up in the structure as we can to get as much hot air out of the structure. So what we do is we use brackets on the top that will attach to our brace bands. Once we have it all the way up, these telescoping bottoms will allow us to go down and properly put it in place, and then the bottoms will get secured with right-angle brackets, and then everything will get put together with self-tapping screws. All of the vertical pieces run the full length or the full height of the structure. So these different vertical pieces, there's 3 on each side, they're all at different lengths. The bottoms are the same. They come up to basically about 4 feet. The way this is designed is that the studs are 4-foot center to centers along the verticals and also 4-foot center to centers along the horizontals. These pegs, different pieces have different pegs. So where the doors are, you don't need a peg on the inside. That's why this piece right here is the longest because it's closest towards the center, and the pegs go towards the sidewalls. The piece in the middle, since it has 2 different horizontal pieces that attach, it has pegs on both sides, and it's halfway between the height of the middle piece and then the outer piece. The outer piece has 2 pegs here, and then just 1 peg where it attaches to the top. This is an exploded view, so where it'll actually attach to the structure will be slightly different. For the horizontals, along the bottom horizontal stud runs along the ground and has 3 little vertical pegs that come up where these sleeve over those vertical pegs. So the vertical pegs sleeve over the vertical pegs on the horizontal stud. For all the different 2-inch studs attached to the structure, we have these telescoping ends. This is a 1 3/4 inch pipe. It sleeves in and out, allowing adjustment to properly attach very simply to the hoop. So that's how all the different vertical studs and horizontal studs attach to each other. This Endwall design has a sliding door track, which will get attached to the horizontals. We'll probably put that on after the Endwall is up, but this right here shows the different door tracks, and there's brackets welded onto the door tracks for easy assembly. What we're going to do next is we're going to put this whole thing together. We're going to dry fit it before we screw anything together, sleeve all the pieces together, get it fit where we want inside the hoop, and start measuring where exactly we need it so that as we build it, we make sure that we're correctly inside of our hoop, right to left, up and down, and also make sure that our end wall is not twisted. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that now that all the end wall pieces are snug together, that we're building it properly inside the hoop. The end of the hoops right here is right at the bottom of the stake. We make sure it continues to stay in the jig where we want it to be. For this tunnel, it has 8-foot sidewall height for 8-foot trellising. So the bottom of this hoop is 63 inches above the ground. So what we do is we measure from the bottom of the wall up to 63 inches and we put a mark. We do the same thing on this outer vertical stud and on the inner vertical stud. We've run a string from our 2 stakes, which is going to be at that 63 inch from the ground mark, and we make sure that we maintain that height on all of these studs. To then make sure that we're correct right to left within the hoop, we measure from the edge of the hoop into the outer vertical stud on this side and on the other side. If those numbers match, then we know we're correct right to left. After we've done all that, we start screwing the vertical and horizontal studs together. We use a framing square and we ground off the corner of the framing square so it doesn't hit the well. Then we come down and we start here, and we're going to start and build this whole thing as one big panel. We make sure that we're at a right angle here. Then we put in several self-tapping screws. I put in at least 3 and I put them in on each side. In this scenario we use 4. You put 2 in from the top, 1 from each side. After the first screw is in, it can still pivot, so we continue to check our right angles as we put more screws in. After we've done this corner here, we'll move on to another one of the big outer corners. We do a corner here, we'll come here, we'll do all 4 of the big corners. Now that we make sure that those are all square. You can also check that they're square by measuring the diagonals. If the 2 diagonals match, you know the whole panel is square. We'll then come back. We'll make sure that everything is square as we screw together all of the interior right angles. Once the entire panel is screwed together like we have here, we then go and we work on the right angle between this panel and the horizontal stud above the door. This is definitely one of the most important right angles to get right because that is the door frame. So we measure this here and we screw this together. Now that this entire panel is screwed together, we're going to go over to the other side and we're going to screw that entire panel together. After the whole wall is together as one piece, we'll then screw the peak vent frame into the horizontal stud above the door. Then we'll come back, we'll put all of our telescoping ends to our brace bands, make sure we're very happy with exactly how the Endwall is laying within the hoops, bolt the telescoping ends to the brace bands and screw those together. The other thing that is really important is to make sure that you build this all flat. We're lucky here, this was all excavated, we know that we have a perfectly flat plane. If you were on an area that was not flat, you'd want to shim up different parts of the end wall to make sure you're building it all flat and in one plane. We're continuing work on the 30-foot wide fixed high tunnel with 2 4x8 sliding doors and a peak vent. We've already had the hoop top built. We showed a video of the exploded view. Now we've basically put it together but haven't fastened anything or screwed anything together. First thing that we did was we mounted the peak vent into the hoop. To do that, we found the center point of the hoop. We made sure that the brace bands and the brackets that attach to the peak vent were centered in the peak, making sure that this is correct right to left. We made sure that our pivot bolts are above center. So if you measure where the pivot bolts are for the peak vent, you'll notice that they're slightly above center, and that's so that the gravity of the peak vent will naturally want to have it closed shut. The bolts on the bottom that bolt the peak vent shut, they are on the bottom, so they're easier to get out on a ladder when you do need to bolt this shut. The first thing we did was we put the end bracket to the side of the peak vent. We put a couple self-tapping screws in here to make sure that that was secure. Now that we know that the bracket is secure to here, we then lined up our brace band. Our bolts are still going up, so the entire end wall we're building on this is the inside of the end wall, and the underside that's touching the ground is the outside. So why the polycarbonate is down. We want to be really careful not to damage the polycarbonate. In this scenario, we left all the polycarbonate onto the vent. Once the brace band bolt was snugged and we made sure that it was centered, we made sure there were 2 self-tapping screws in the seam and 1 in the brace band. Over here, it was easy to put a self-tapping screw through the brace band and the seam to get our second screw. So now our peak vent is mounted where it needs to be. Going back to our original template for the hoop, we have a stake on each corner of the hoop that tells us where the bottom of the hoop goes. So it's important as you're building this that you always make sure that the bottom of the hoop is lined up with the stakes. Then we ran a string from this stake to the stake on the other side, and that string will end up being parallel to the ground. Once we have this parallel to the ground, since this high tunnel has 8-foot trellis height, this seam right here, the end of this hoop, will end up being 63 inches from the ground. So what we do is we went and we measured from the bottom of these pieces after they were all put together and made a mark at 63 inches to ensure that this string is at the proper location. We also came over to the vent. We found the center point of the vent, which we knew we had already centered. We found the center point with the horizontal stud underneath it to make sure that our end wall is centered right to left properly. Our retractable studs inside the bottom of the peak vent are down and ready to be screwed in. In the top of all the vertical studs, we've installed the telescoping end, which will attach to the brace band. So all 3 of the telescoping ends have been installed. The brace bands are in place. We have run our strings to make sure that our end wall is parallel to the ground. Our peak vent is installed, so right now we know that our end wall is properly right to left inside of our end wall and also parallel to the ground.